February 20th, 2021, Boynton Beach, Florida. It's the depths of winter for most of the country, but here in South Florida, the sun is shining brightly.
Boynton Beach is about 50 miles from Miami. A lot of working class families and all around a great town to live in.
It's kind of old Florida, if you will. Crime does not happen in this type of neighborhood.
But that morning, one local family is starting to panic.
They hadn't heard from their loved one, 44-year-old Mary Gomez Millet, in 2 days. That Tuesday was the last time I spoke with her. My cousin in Colombia calls me and says, "Prima, have you heard anything from Mary today?" I said, "No, I haven't heard from her in a couple of days." And he tells me, "Can you call her? Because we're calling her phone, but the call is not going through." So I called her phone, and her phone was going to voicemail.
"Mary, please give me a call back when you get this."
And I said, "Something is not adding up here."
So Sandra decides to contact the authorities.
"I need to file a missing persons report."
I called the police, and I remember, like if it was today, it was Saturday morning. They tell me that in order for us to report her missing, we had to wait.
"What do you mean 72 hours?
I said, "How can we wait 72 hours without knowing what's happened? We have no signs of her. We are calling her and her phone goes straight to voicemail." So it was very stressful to us.
The family has to wait another grueling 24 hours before they can officially report Mary missing.
By then, Sunday morning, they opened an investigation. They had asked about Mary, what she was wearing that day. I said, "I don't know because I wasn't with her." "What does she normally carry with her?" I said, "She carries a purse."
The large black tote bag?
She always in her purse had her lipstick and her rosary. That's one thing that Mary would not ever be without.
The last time somebody had spoken to her was on February 18th of 2021. Nobody had heard from her. They were really concerned because it just wasn't like her.
Listen, we're gonna do everything that we can to find your cousin, okay?
It's so hard, I can't. But we were still holding on to hope that she was gonna be found alive.
44-year-old Mary Gomez Millet had immigrated to America from Colombia after escaping an abusive relationship.
She was very friendly, very religious. You had a problem, she will come and say, "Okay, how can I help you? What do you need?"
Tomó la decisión de venirse para acá con su hija y con su hijo. Eso era lo que ella buscaba aquí, una tranquilidad y un mejor futuro para sus hijos.
She wanted to be that supportive mother. She wanted them to go to college here.
However, getting settled in their new home of Boynton Beach, Florida, wouldn't be easy.
In Colombia, Mary built a successful career as a biomedical scientist.
But unfortunately, her education credentials didn't cross over into the United States.
Sin documentos no podía ubicarse, no un trabajo. Ella a veces se iba a limpiar casas.
But after establishing roots in the community, Mary came across a special opportunity.
She was looking for a better job. Someone in the church has said to her, "There's a lady that needs someone to take care of her because she lives by herself. She's starting to have the signs of dementia."
She lived down in Hialeah, which is in Miami, Florida. So Hialeah from Boynton Beach is probably a 2-hour drive.
Ella se fue a cuidar a esta señora allá a Hialeah. La señora la quería.
Hey, thank you, my dear.
Se quedó cuidando a doña ella 24/7. Ella vivía allí con ella.
At this point, Mary's kids were grown and off doing their own thing.
And it was at her new job where Mary met the man who would eventually become her husband.
Mary, this is my son, Roberto.
Very pleased to meet you, Mary.
Likewise.
Mary's patient had a 66-year-old son named Roberto Colon. And almost instantly, they found a connection amongst each other.
I can't tell you how much it means that you're taking good care of my mother, to her and to me.
I'm happy to help. She's such a special woman.
Roberto lived in Boynton Beach, where Mary originally settled after moving to the U.S.
He'd come down to Hialeah now and then to visit his mother.
But after meeting Mary, he had another reason to visit.
Mary and Roberto developed a relationship and it was on the fast track.
Lo conoció en diciembre y ya en febrero se casó con él.
But just 1 month after saying I do, Mary has mysteriously disappeared, and no one in her family has been able to get in touch with her.
This is when the nightmare really starts.
It was just radio silent, and that was completely abnormal for Mary and her communication style with her family.
Listen, we're gonna do everything that we can to find your cousin, okay?
The Boynton Beach Police Department, they take their report. It immediately gets sent over to a missing persons detective, who then starts to investigate.
Investigators begin by going to the home of Mary's husband, Roberto Colon.
If Mary is missing, why wasn't her new husband the one who made the missing report? For the police and investigators, this immediately sticks out.
But when police ask Roberto about his wife's disappearance, he doesn't seem to share the family's concern.
I don't know where I'm at with this thing.
Roberto tells police that the last time he saw his wife was 2 days ago, February 18th.
But he doesn't think she's missing. He thinks she's on the run.
And that's because the last interaction they had was a heated confrontation in which Roberto confronted Mary for stealing his mother's money.
She took my bank, my check card.
After escaping an abusive relationship in her home country, 44-year-old Colombian native Mary Gomez Millet was making a fresh start for herself in southern Florida.
Mary pivoted to being a home health care aide where she began taking care of an elderly woman.
And when she met her client's son, Roberto Colon, her life changed forever.
They got married just a couple of months after meeting each other.
But now Mary is missing. And as Boynton police pay a visit to her husband, Roberto, he claims his wife may have good reason to hide.
She took my bank, my check card.
He said he had access to his mother's bank accounts, and he noticed money was just missing from the accounts. Credit cards were opened, a new car was leased in his mother's name, and he felt like Mary was behind all this and was stealing from his mother.
I don't know what to do. I don't want to ingress my mother. She worked all her life for that apartment.
Roberto says when he discovered what was going on, he told Mary to bring the new car to his house immediately.
He asked for the vehicle to be delivered back to his residence all the way up in Boynton Beach.
I don't know what to do, man. I've never been presented with this kind of crap.
How could you do this, Mary?
He said that when she arrived at his house, they got into an argument, but he said it wasn't really heated, it wasn't physical.
When I confronted her with this, I said, no, I didn't do anything. But then I had an appointment the same day that she came here to the urologist.
We'll talk about this when I get back from my appointment.
He said the argument ended because he had to go to a doctor's appointment, and he told Mary that when he got back from his doctor's appointment, that he was going to take her back to Hialeah and turn her in to the Hialeah Police Department.
He did it all at my mother's house. Yeah, they will have to handle that with him.
When he left, Mary was still at his house.
He said when he returned from his appointment, the car was still there, but she was gone.
I don't think the biggest fool that she was.
He assumed that she was scared, that she was going to get arrested, and had a friend come pick her up or something, and now was just hiding out.
Police ask Roberto if he has any idea where Mary could be hiding out. And that's when he admits he doesn't actually know his new wife all that well.
They had only met in December of 2020, and they kind of developed a friendly relationship at first, but then kind of came up with an arrangement of how this would progress.
I needed her to help me with my mother and help me with my house because I'm in the middle of trying to fix crap up, and you know, I can't do everything at one time, and I figured it'd be a good relationship.
Basically, they came up with an agreement that Mary would take care of Roberto's mother. In exchange, Roberto would marry Mary so that she could get U.S. citizenship.
It was an agreement brokered by Roberto's mother.
Mary had said to her that, you know, we're gonna have to start helping you look for someone else because my cousin wants me to go to Orlando to fix my papers. The lady said, no, you're not leaving me. You can stay here with me. I'm gonna talk to my son. You can marry my son and he can give you the residency. Please don't leave me.
He was very open about their relationship, that they were legally married, but you know, it was more of a deal that they had made, each of them to benefit from it.
And it got me to tell you the truth.
After wrapping up their conversation with Roberto, police continue their investigation back at headquarters.
Can they trust Roberto's account of his relationship with Mary?
We were able to pull stuff from Mary's phone records. The main thing that we found was that the day that she was last known to be at Roberto's house, from that point forward, there was no location data, no messages, no phone calls. The phone was off.
And as detectives continue searching for clues, they make an alarming discovery in a police report filed 5 days earlier.
They see that on February 18th, just a few hours after Mary was last seen, Boynton Beach police received a call about an abandoned purse.
So, like, he's over here. Just in the road, you know, in the ditch, right?
Uh-huh.
This purse was located less than a mile from Roberto Colon's house.
And that's not all.
It reportedly had blood on it.
Is that blood? I should have some blood.
There's blood on it?
Mm-hmm.
The officer that collected the purse, he brought it back to the police department and immediately brought it into the crime scene lab.
When he turned the purse over to me, there was a substantial amount of blood on the purse. His gloves were actually covered in blood after he handled it.
There was no identification within the purse, but there was some items contained within the purse that were documented and photographed.
There was several pieces of paper in the rosary.
For the detectives investigating Mary's missing persons case, this is no coincidence.
So law enforcement, spidey senses kind of pick up and realize maybe this is Mary's purse.
We had gotten a picture from the family that showed Mary wearing a rosary, and the rosary that she was wearing in the picture was very similar to the rosary we found in the purse.
Just then, detectives learn there's a woman who is eager to speak with them. Mary's close friend, Margarita Arango.
Yeah, patch her through.
She says she has some vital information to share with detectives regarding Mary's disappearance.
Bueno, ¿tú me puedes decir qué fue la última vez que tú hablaste con ella?
Yo hablé el jueves de la semana pasada, a las 2 de la tarde fue la última llamada, el último contacto que tuvimos ella y yo.
¿A las 2 de la tarde?
Sí, señor, a las 2.
Ok.
Ella al mediodía iba para Unsolved. Se dijo que iba para allá a llevarle el carro al señor Roberto.
Ella me dijo, Maggi, ya estoy acá en la casa de Roberto. Voy a entregarle el carro Ya no quiero seguir más con esta situación. Ya estoy aburrida, ya yo no quiero nada con él.
Entonces le dije, mami, alguna cosa me avisa. Le dije así, dijo, listo. Yo le dije a ella, listo. Entonces cuando yo le dije así, el teléfono de ella y el teléfono mío quedaron abiertos.
The last thing she heard from Mary was she heard Mary scream.
Ella me dijo, Margie, Roberto, Roberto. Y yo sentí un golpe. Y ahí se fue la comunicación.
Boynton Beach police have increased search efforts in the case of missing 44-year-old Mary Gomez Millette after the discovery of a bloody purse less than 5 blocks from her husband's home.
The lab was able to accept the swabs from the purse, and the lab determined that it was consistent with human blood.
But there wasn't enough of a sample for them to be able to come back with a definitive DNA analysis one way or the other.
Now, Mary's friend Margarita Arango is providing even more reason for police to suspect foul play.
She said she was on the phone with Mary when she was at Roberto's house.
Margarita told law enforcement that she heard Mary screaming, "No, no, no, Roberto." And then the phone cut out. And that was the last she heard from Mary.
Yo sentí como que el tipo la agredió a ella, como si le hubiera quedado el celular. Algo tuvo que haberle hecho el tipo a ella porque después de ese momento ya yo no voy a tener más comunicación con ella.
From the phone records, we know that from that point forward, that phone was off.
And when Margarita heard that Mary had gone missing, she knew she needed to inform police about what she'd witnessed.
Lo único que yo quería era encontrar a Mari. Yo quería encontrarle y darle un abrazo y saber que ella estaba bien.
Police decide it's time to bring Roberto Colon in for a formal interview.
Go ahead and just give me your legal name. Roberto Colon.
Detectives confront Roberto with the information and evidence that they've found. They tell him about the conversation they had with Margarita, and they also confront him about the bloody purse.
Her purse, yeah. We have her purse. It has blood on it. You know it's her purse? 100% it's her purse. Okay. So we need your help in making sense of that because I can't make sense of it.
Roberto says he knows nothing about it. And to prove that he's innocent, he agrees to submit to a DNA sample.
He consented to giving us his DNA. He took his shirt off so we could take pictures of his body to make sure there was no injuries. I mean, he was just so compliant.
Detectives have a lot of information, but not enough to arrest him.
They still don't have a body.
So detectives ask Roberto for permission to search his home.
You're okay if we go back now. We might need you to stay outside for a little bit while we do this search. We can spray this chemical that will show us if there's any blood or anything. Yeah.
Police ask, hey, can we walk inside and just take a look and make sure Mary's not here?
You're okay with that? Yeah.
He gave us consent, so he was allowed to be there, and we just had to do what we needed to do.
After arriving at the home, it's not long before investigators notice a chilling piece of evidence.
One of the crime scene techs noticed a little speckle of blood on the front door of the house.
Inside the home, there's additional cause for alarm.
The house inside did not have floors, it was bare concrete. Did not have drywall in many places, it was just kind of like a sheetrock wall, unfinished.
They asked him about that, and he said that he's been renovating his home, and so he ripped up some of the floorboards and has yet to replace them.
But out in the garage, crime scene techs uncover the most alarming evidence of all.
Roberto drove a Chevrolet Suburban, and the back seat of that vehicle was inside that garage next to the dog crate. I noticed what appeared to be bloodstains on the bottom of that seat There was a large green toolbox on the floor of the garage. There was a possible blood spatter on that, and the wall above that seat and toolbox.
We knew that with the blood and the spatter, someone was more than likely killed in that garage.
The disappearance of 44-year-old Mary Gomez Millette has led Boynton Beach detectives back to the home of her husband, Roberto Colon, where they've just discovered what appears to be blood spatter.
So we did the stringing and we did all the calculations for the blood spatter analysis.
While we were doing that, Roberto was standing at the door and kind of asking what Tina was doing. So I decided just to tell him, like, hey, listen, we found some spots there that look like blood spatter, and she's collecting samples of those. He said, listen, you guys can test that blood all you want. That's gonna be animal blood from my dog.
He mentioned that that was from his dog's tail that was cut or something. And I knew from my experience that didn't come from a dog. We knew that with the blood and the spatter that someone was more than likely killed in that garage.
When the blood test results come back, they confirm everyone's worst fears.
It was the next day that we got the results and were able to say that that blood was human blood that we collected in the workshop and on the front door.
But without a body, police are unable to prove it is actually Mary Gomez Millette's blood.
They didn't have any DNA from Mary, so they can't confirm if the blood actually came from her.
Regardless, investigators decide it's time to bring in the cadaver dogs.
What they ultimately ended up doing is bringing a cadaver dog to go around the inside and then the outside, the perimeter of the home. But the dog never indicated that they found anything of decomp in that backyard or contained within the home.
Even though the cadaver dog came up short, investigators aren't ready to walk away just yet.
Hello, Detective Valari.
A short time after us beginning our search, I receive a call from the neighbor almost at the same time. And he tells me, hey, listen, this guy's over here and he's saying some crazy stuff.
He's in another room.
He says Roberto is saying things like, they are not going to find her.
The neighbor also tells police that Roberto keeps asking him to look outside and see if there's a hearse parked in front of his home.
You guys need to be careful.
The neighbor was concerned for our safety because Roberto made some statements that I should just get an axe and charge at them and force them to kill me. Or I believe he said I should get an AK-47 and just mow them down.
All right, yeah, we'll come right over. Don't worry, we won't let him know you called us.
Okay. So we end up going to the neighbor's house to make contact with Roberto.
Hey, buddy.
These type of psychological and emotional moments are important with investigations like this. It's clear Roberto is in a very agitated state, and detectives want to see if his heightened emotions will cause him to slip up and say something that will help in their investigation.
How typical. You're more concerned about her than what she did to me and my mother for months.
He becomes very distressed, going on about the detectives wasting his time.
He starts making statements, you know, very vulgar statements about Mary, calling her names. It's actually at that point, too, that he refers to his workshop as an abattoir, which is a slaughterhouse, you know, specifically usually for animals.
Whoa. What's that supposed to mean?
Roberto, at this point, seems to be alluding to police that he killed Mary. But when they continue to directly ask him if he had anything to do with it, he tells the police, do your job, find the body.
It seemed like he was just taunting us and trying to play a game with us, you know? So we end up going, hey, listen, you're not gonna be able to go home right now. We're holding your house.
We're gonna get you a hotel. You can come back when we're done.
Initially, he did not want to go to the hotel. He wanted to stay at the neighbor's house. And the neighbor, being the nice guy that he was, he said, listen, I will house your pets, but given the circumstances, I'm feeling a little uncomfortable with you staying here. So Roberto agreed to go to the hotel.
As darkness falls over the Boynton Beach property, detectives face the frustrating reality that they're not any closer to locating Mary.
There was a specific field where we knew Roberto would go to walk his dog. So we have officers searching those big fields, wooded areas. We have officers in boats, in canal banks in the area, checking for any evidence.
But by the next morning, there's still no sign of Mary.
We were doing subpoenas and getting back Roberto's financial records, going through phone records.
That's when detectives get a visit from Roberto's former tenant, Luciana Torres.
Yeah, go ahead and send her in.
Luciana had a bunker trailer that was located on Roberto's property.
It was just a temporary arrangement. She didn't live there very long.
Luciana tells police that she was often in earshot when Roberto spoke to Mary.
She's overheard conversations that he's had with Mary, ending with phrases like, I'm gonna kill this woman and bury her in my backyard.
Those are his exact words?
It wasn't until this conversation with Luciana that I said, you know what, I think now at this point, I have enough to go on to get another search warrant to dig the yard. The only thing that's given me some apprehension about this, I felt like that first dog that did the search, that if she was there, that dog would have hit.
But the cadaver dog trainer convinces the detective to give it one more shot.
He actually told me, he said, listen, at the end of the day, if my dog doesn't hit, you should still dig up that ground.
So investigators return to Roberto's home and get to work.
There was a shed back in the backyard, and off to the side of this shed was an area where there was bricks laid on the ground. I remember Rob looking at that area and calling me over.
If you notice in photographs, all the patio stones have grass or weeds growing in between the cracks. As I'm probing, I'm noticing that these bricks have no grass or weeds growing in the cracks.
These bricks, they're very fresh. Like I could just remove them very easy. It's like they're almost just recently set.
And I started moving a couple bricks going further in, and then I hit something.
You could smell the smell that we know of, unfortunately, from, working all these years of decomposition.
I remember I looked up at him, and he was staring at me, and I'm like, there she is.
Boynton Beach police have been searching for evidence that 44-year-old Mary Gomez Millet's husband, Roberto Colon, is responsible for her disappearance. Now they may have finally found it in Roberto's own backyard.
I would say it was 3 to 4 feet below ground is when we first noticed skin.
I remember I looked up at him, and he was staring at me, and I'm like, there she is.
As they're shuffling the dirt away, we start to see that this body doesn't have any legs below the kneecap or a head.
They're not able to find the head, but what they do find is a metal steel pipe that was buried next to the torso. Detectives believe that this is the murder weapon.
That pipe was solid steel, but it was bent, like it hit something hard. And, we later came to find out that both of Mary's forearms were broken and the bones were completely cracked, almost kind of like a defensive posture.
The remains are transported to the medical examiner's office.
She did still have skin on her fingers, so the medical investigator was able to get fingerprints from her.
They are able to compare the fingerprints they took from the torso to the fingerprints that the Colombian consulate has. It's a positive match. This is the torso of Mary Gomez Millet.
Cuando me entró la llamada a darme la noticia de que la habían encontrado allá en la casa de este hombre, en las condiciones que la encontraron, eso para mí fue muy duro, demasiado. Me sentía muy triste.
When the detectives tells me we found Mary, but unfortunately I have to tell you that she's not alive. My whole world just stops right there. Like, how am I gonna tell the family? You know, that we're still keeping that hope over there.
Fortunately, though, police now have enough evidence to charge Roberto Colon with first-degree murder. But even in handcuffs, Roberto is still smug as ever.
Prior to him being transported to the police department, I wanted to see if he would make any last statements to the neighbor.
The neighbor came out and said, "Hey man, what's going on? Is everything okay?" And he just laughed and said, "Yeah, everything's fine. Don't worry. They're never going to be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again."
Humpty Dumpty, as we all know, is a character that had all his limbs fall apart. So what Roberto is saying is chilling.
Getting him to reveal the location of Mary's head is going to be no easy task.
However, detectives know they have to try. Back at the police station, they sit down with Roberto once again.
He wasn't very talkative at this point. I started the interview by showing him a picture of the body, just to see his reaction, and he was kind of not even fazed by it.
Roberto, I'm going to say to you, man, you're crafty, you have outsmarted us in a lot of ways, and even now, after we have found her body, we're still asking ourselves a lot of questions, okay?
Now they're at a pivotal moment in the interrogation. They could tell Roberto doesn't want to tell them the truth, but they use their skills to try and get it out of him.
Like I told Marco the other guys, I'm like, he's smart, man. This guy's smart. He still has us right now, scratching our head, trying to figure this out.
Detectives continue to press him about where Mary's head is and where her legs are. Roberto refuses to give any further information and says that there will never be closure for anyone.
We don't have the head. Okay.
What do you want me to do about it?
Detectives at this point believe that they're not going to get any further information from Roberto. He's just going to continue playing games. They book him on first-degree murder charges, and then they send Roberto over to Palm Beach County Jail.
In February 2022, almost 1 year after Mary Gomez Millet's murder, Roberto Colon heads to trial.
It's weird because, you know, you'd think, how could you even be nervous? You found her in his backyard, but there's never an easy trial to go into as a detective.
Right off the bat, it becomes clear to prosecutors that this calculated killer isn't going down without a fight.
He says that Mary is the one who caused all of this, and he acted out in self-defense.
After discovering the remains of 44-year-old Mary Gomez Millet in her husband's backyard, Florida officials are hoping for a swift conviction.
It's always difficult for prosecution when you don't have an eyewitness to a crime, but with all of the circumstantial evidence, everything was pointing in the same direction, and that direction was directly at Roberto Colon.
But as the trial gets underway, the defense presents an astonishing claim that Roberto was acting in self-defense.
The defense did the unique decision of calling Roberto Colon to the stand to testify in his own defense. And when Roberto testified, he talked all about how Mary thieved from him and stole from his mother.
Roberto says that he confronted Mary and she became violent.
He said that they were walking out towards the garage area and that she had her purse, she swung it at him and hit him with it, and that he basically lost control and picked up the nearest item and just hit her in the head with it.
But when it's the prosecution's turn, they methodically disassemble the defense's case.
Mary's screams that her friend Margarita heard over the phone suggest that it was Roberto who attacked first and not the other way around.
Roberto planned this homicide. He lured her to his residence. He knew what he was going to do.
Roberto?
There was absolutely no proof that Mary was stealing. She was using the mother's money, but for the mother's caretaking.
Even though he had no confirmed proof that she in fact was doing this, he decided he was going to take matters into his own hands and beat her to death.
He then dismembered her body because he didn't know what to do with it after he killed her.
Based on the disturbing statements he went on to make to his neighbor and the police, it's clear that he didn't feel any regret for what he'd done. Roberto was glad he'd murdered Mary until he got caught for it.
When I cross-examined him, I asked him how many times he hit her, and he said he just kept hitting her repeatedly, over and over and over. It was very obvious to my jury that he was reliving and sort of fantasizing about his crime.
When prosecutors question Roberto about Mary's remaining limbs, they don't get the answer they were hoping for.
Roberto testified that he buried them in the backyard, but when I tell you law enforcement ripped up that backyard, they would have found it. And so, truthfully, I don't know what he did with the legs, nor do we truthfully know what he did with her head.
When the jury retires to deliberate, everyone is holding their breath.
They deliberated for longer than I thought. That's always nerve-wracking. I thought it would be 10-minute deliberation, but it went on for, I think, a couple hours.
However, it's soon clear no one is sympathizing with Roberto.
When they returned, they found him guilty of premeditated murder, and he was then sentenced to life in prison without parole.
This case stood out because of the brutality. I mean, I've never had a case like this where it was that violent and somebody did something that brazen.
He felt justified in what he did. He thought he could get away with it.
La peor decisión que la mamá de Roberto tomó, haberle presentado a su hijo, fue una persona muy espectacular, una buena amiga, una buena mamá, una buena hija, una buena mujer. No encuentro palabras negativas para Mari, no las encuentro.
She came here from Colombia to start a new life. And soon after she arrived, she didn't know that she was making a deal with the devil.
Oh my God, I wish I could hug her one more time. Mary was a beautiful soul, always. No matter the hard time that she was having, she will swallow all her pain and give you nothing but love.
Mary's loved ones hope her story can serve as a cautionary tale for others who decide to give their trust and love without boundaries.
Maybe this had to happen for us to spread the word for other women who are being victims to please speak, come out, don't fear. Fear is what's gonna lead you to a nightmare, to a situation like this. There's always help out there.
April 4, 2015 began like an ordinary spring day in North Charleston, South Carolina. The roads were open. The neighborhoods were quiet. People were moving through their routines, heading to work, running errands, visiting family, thinking about the weekend ahead. There was nothing about that morning that suggested it would become the beginning of a story remembered across the United States. Walter Lamar Scott was driving his Mercedes-Benz through the city. He was 50 years old. He was a father, a brother, a man with responsibilities, habits, frustrations, plans, and an ordinary life that extended far beyond the few minutes that would eventually define how millions of strangers came to know his name. That morning, however, something as insignificant as a broken brake light would bring his car to a stop. A police cruiser was behind him. Inside was Officer Michael Slager of the North Charleston Police Department. The reason for the traffic stop was simple. The center brake light on Scott's vehicle was not functioning properly. There was no indication that this was supposed to become anything more than a routine encounter. A traffic violation. A conversation. Perhaps a warning. Perhaps a ticket. Then everyone would drive away. But sometimes, the most consequential moments in a person's life begin with something so ordinary that nobody notices it. A defective light. A police officer. A driver. A few minutes on a South Carolina road. And then, everything changed. What happened next would eventually become one of the most closely examined police shootings in modern American history. But before the photographs, before the courtroom, before the headlines, before the arguments about police power and civil rights, there was only Walter Scott running across an open piece of ground with a police officer behind him. And somewhere nearby, another man was holding a cell phone. His name was Fadin Santana. He had no idea that the small device in his hand was about to become one of the most important witnesses in the entire case. At first, Santana was simply a passerby. He was not a police officer. He was not an investigator. He was not a journalist. He had no badge, no authority, and no reason to believe that what he was witnessing would eventually be studied frame by investigators, lawyers, judges, and millions of people around the country. He was simply there. And because he was there, history was recorded. Walter Scott had left his vehicle after being stopped. Then he ran. The reason he ran would become a subject of intense discussion. There would be questions about what Scott feared, what he believed might happen, and why he decided that running was preferable to remaining beside his car. But those questions would later become tangled with something much larger. Because once Scott began running, Officer Slager followed. The distance between them changed rapidly. The chase continued for roughly 200 yards. The landscape was open enough for the two men to remain visible. Slager pursued Scott with his taser. Twice, he attempted to use it. The first attempt did not stop Scott. The second attempt caused Scott to fall. For a brief moment, it appeared that the chase might finally be over. But Scott got back up. And he ran again. That image would become impossible to forget. A man moving away. A uniformed officer following behind. The space between them. And then a gun. Later, Officer Slager would describe the encounter in a very different way. He would say that Scott had fought with him. He would say that Scott had taken possession of the taser. He would say that the weapon had become a threat. The distinction was enormous. Because if Scott had turned toward the officer and attacked him with the taser, the shooting could potentially be understood as a desperate response to an immediate threat. But if Scott was running away, if his back was turned, if he was no longer presenting an imminent danger, then the meaning of those gunshots became something entirely different. That difference would eventually determine the course of the case. But in those first moments, nobody knew what the future would reveal. Scott continued running. Slager followed. And then the gun came out. 8 shots. The sound of each shot would disappear almost as quickly as it arrived, but the consequences would last for years. Scott was struck 5 times. The bullets entered his body from behind. He fell. The man who had been running only seconds earlier was suddenly lying motionless on the ground. There was no dramatic final confrontation. No prolonged struggle visible in the footage that would later become public. No moment in which Walter Scott stood face to face with the officer and charged toward him. Instead, there was distance. There was a fleeing man. And there were gunshots. For the people who would eventually watch the video, those seconds would feel almost unbearably simple. That was what made them so powerful. The camera did not explain everything. It did not show every second before the shooting. It did not reveal what Walter Scott had been thinking. It could not tell viewers what had happened inside his mind when he decided to run. But it captured something that words could not easily erase. Walter Scott was moving away from Michael Slager when the shots were fired. And that fact would become the center of everything that followed. Immediately after the shooting, the official story began to take shape. Slager reported that Scott had taken his taser. He described a confrontation in which he believed he was under threat. To someone who had not seen what actually happened, the account might have sounded plausible. A police officer had chased a suspect. There had been a physical struggle. A taser was involved. The officer had fired his weapon. Scott was dead. The details could have remained buried beneath the authority of an official report. That happens when there are no witnesses. A dead man cannot contradict the report written about him. A grieving family may know the person they lost, but they cannot reconstruct every second of a confrontation they did not see. And when the only surviving account comes from the person holding the weapon, the story can become frighteningly simple. But Walter Scott's story was not left entirely in the hands of the person who shot him. Because somewhere behind the scene, Faden Santana had his phone. And he had recorded what happened. The video would later become the dividing line between two versions of reality. Before the video, there was an officer's account. After the video, investigators had something else. Something visual. Something that could be paused. Replayed. Examined. Magnified. A piece of evidence that did not become tired, frightened, confused, or defensive. A recording that simply remained what it was. For Walter Scott's family, the discovery of that video would change everything. For investigators, it would force a closer examination of every detail. For Michael Slager, it would transform the case from a police shooting into a criminal investigation. And for the country, the footage would become another painful example of how a camera can expose a gap between what is said and what actually happened. But before that video reached the public, before the investigation accelerated, before prosecutors entered the picture, there was a family waiting for answers. There was a father who would never return home. There were people who knew Walter not as a name in a news report, but as a human being. They knew his voice. They knew his personality. They knew the ordinary things that made him Walter. The way he spoke. The way he carried himself. The responsibilities he had. The people who expected to see him again. None of those things could be seen in the few seconds captured by Santana's phone. That was one of the cruelest realities of the case. The world would come to know Walter Scott primarily through his final moments. His life was measured against the moment of his death. But Walter Scott had lived for 50 years before that morning. He had been more than the man running from a police officer. More than the man whose body fell after 8 shots. More than the name printed beneath photographs. More than the symbol into which the case would eventually transform him. He was a human being whose life had been reduced, in the public imagination, to a few seconds of video. And those seconds were enough to change American law enforcement conversations, but they could never show the life that came before them. That is why the story of Walter Scott cannot begin with the gunshots. It has to begin with the ordinary morning that preceded them. Because tragedy rarely announces itself. It does not always arrive with warning. Sometimes it hides inside routine. A car traveling down a familiar road. A police cruiser appearing in the rearview mirror. Red lights flashing. A driver pulling over. A conversation beginning. And then, in a matter of minutes, a life ending. On that April morning, Walter Scott could not have known that his name would soon appear across national television screens. He could not have known that his final moments would be watched by strangers around the world. He could not have known that the man chasing him would eventually stand before a federal judge. He could not have known that his death would become part of a national debate about race, policing, accountability, and the use of deadly force. He certainly could not have known that the most important witness to his final moments would not be a detective or a courtroom expert. It would be a stranger walking nearby with a phone. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of the story. The difference between being remembered as a man who died during a police encounter and being remembered as a man whose death was captured on video came down to chance. Santana happened to be there. His phone happened to be in his hand. He happened to press record. And Walter Scott happened to be running through the frame. Those circumstances would become the thread connecting the dead to the truth. But on that morning, none of that mattered yet. There was only a man running. There was an officer behind him. There was a gun. And there were 8 shots. 5 found their target from behind. Walter Scott fell to the ground. The chase was over. But the story had only just begun. To understand what happened to Walter Scott, it is necessary to slow the story down. Not to the moment when the gun was fired. Not to the instant when his body fell. But to the ordinary world that existed before the shooting, before the flashing lights, before the chase, before the video that would eventually travel across America. Walter Lamar Scott was 50 years old. To strangers, that number might sound like a simple fact. To his family, it represented 5 decades of memories. 5 decades of birthdays, arguments, laughter, disappointments, responsibilities, relationships, work, and the small routines that make up an ordinary life. He was not famous. He was not a politician. He was not a public figure. There was nothing about his life that suggested that one day his name would become part of a national conversation. He was simply Walter. A man living in North Charleston, South Carolina, a place where humid air, broad roads, quiet neighborhoods, and the steady movement of everyday life created a landscape that could feel completely ordinary. On April 4, 2015, the city was moving through another spring day. The sun was up. Cars traveled along the roads. People were beginning their weekend routines. Some were heading toward work. Others were going home. Families were making plans. Stores were opening. Traffic came and went. Nothing in the atmosphere suggested that something irreversible was about to happen. Walter Scott was driving. At some point, a police cruiser appeared behind him. Inside that cruiser was Officer Michael Slager. Slager was a North Charleston police officer, trained to enforce the law and respond to situations that could potentially become dangerous. From his perspective, the vehicle ahead had a problem. The center brake light was not functioning properly. It was a traffic violation. The kind of violation that, under ordinary circumstances, might produce a short conversation beside the road and then disappear into the rest of the day. The officer activated his emergency lights. Scott's vehicle stopped. That should have been the end of the story. But it was not. It is tempting, when looking backward at a tragedy, to imagine that the ending was somehow visible from the beginning. It was not. There was no sign on the road warning that a man was about to die. There was no obvious moment when everyone present could have understood that the situation had crossed some invisible line. At first, it was simply a traffic stop. A police officer approached a vehicle. A driver was inside. The officer had questions. The driver had answers. Then Walter Scott left the vehicle and began to run. That decision became one of the most debated parts of the case. Why did he run? What was he afraid of? What was happening inside his mind? What did he believe would happen if he stayed? These questions mattered because they were part of the story that followed him into the final moments of his life. But there was something important about those questions that should never be forgotten. Running from a police officer does not automatically make a person a deadly threat. A person can make a bad decision. A person can panic. A person can become frightened. A person can run. And none of those things, by themselves, explain what happened next. Slager pursued him. The chase moved away from the stopped vehicle. The two men crossed roughly 200 yards. For the people who would later study the case, those yards became almost like a timeline. Every step mattered. Every movement mattered. Every position mattered. The distance between Scott and Slager mattered. The position of the taser mattered. The direction in which Scott was moving mattered. And eventually, the direction of the bullets mattered. But in those first moments, there was no courtroom. There were no lawyers standing beside the scene. There were no jurors listening carefully to testimony. There was no judge preparing to evaluate evidence. There were only two men moving quickly across the landscape. Slager used his taser. The first attempt failed to stop Scott. Then another attempt was made. This time, Scott fell. For a moment, the chase seemed to end. But Scott got back up. He continued running. That decision would later become one of the most important images in the entire case. Because the final moments were not recorded from the perspective of someone standing directly beside the men. The footage came from a distance. A phone camera. A witness. Fade in Santana. Santana was simply passing through the area. He was not searching for a story. He was not looking for a confrontation. He had no idea that a man named Walter Scott would become connected to his life forever. But he saw the chase. Something about it caught his attention. He raised his phone. He began recording. And suddenly, an ordinary morning became a permanent record. The camera showed Scott running. Behind him was Slager. The officer was armed. Scott was moving away. The scene was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There was no music. No narrator. No warning. No indication that the next few seconds would later be replayed thousands of times. There was only a man trying to get away. Then Slager raised his firearm. The first shot was fired. Then another. Then another. 8 shots in total. The distance between the two men remained one of the most important details. Scott did not appear to be charging toward the officer. He was moving in the opposite direction. He was running away. 5 bullets struck him. His body suddenly changed direction. The man who had been moving forward collapsed. The chase ended where his life ended. The image is difficult to absorb because of how quickly everything happens. One moment, Walter Scott is alive and moving. The next, he is on the ground. The difference between those two moments is measured in seconds. But the consequences would be measured in years. After the shooting, the scene changed. The pursuit was finished. The urgency of the chase was gone. Now there was a body on the ground. There was an armed police officer standing nearby. There was evidence scattered across the area. And there was a story beginning to form. Slager would provide his account of what had happened. According to his initial explanation, Scott had taken possession of the taser during the struggle and had used it in a threatening manner. That detail was critical. A taser can incapacitate a person. It can be used as a weapon. If an officer genuinely believes that a suspect has taken his weapon and is about to use it against him, the legal analysis can change dramatically. But the problem was that there was another witness. Not a witness standing in a courtroom. Not someone relying entirely on memory. A witness that could not be pressured into changing its story. A video. Santana had captured the final moments. And what the video appeared to show did not match the simplest version of Slager's account. There was another detail. The taser itself. According to the evidence later presented in the case, after the shooting, Slager returned to the area where the taser was lying and picked it up. That action became deeply significant. Because the question was no longer merely what had happened during the struggle. Investigators had to ask what happened immediately afterward. What had been said? What had been moved? What had been reported? What did the officer believe had happened? And most importantly, did the physical evidence support his version? This is where the case began to move from tragedy into investigation. Walter Scott's death could no longer be viewed only as a police shooting. Investigators had to reconstruct the final minutes. They had to examine the position of the men. They had to examine the weapon. They had to examine the taser. They had to examine the wounds. They had to examine the video. And they had to listen carefully to what Slager said. Every detail mattered because the central question was enormous. Was Michael Slager responding to an immediate threat? Or had Walter Scott already been running away when the officer decided to use deadly force? That distinction would determine whether the shooting could be justified. The answer would not come from emotion alone. It would have to come from evidence. And the evidence was beginning to accumulate. For Walter Scott's family, however, none of those legal questions could change the most basic fact. He was dead. A man who had left home that morning would not return. A family would receive news that no family wants to hear. There would be shock first. Then disbelief. Then questions. And eventually, anger. The people who loved Walter would have to confront the reality that his final moments had been reduced to a police report and an unexplained death. They needed to know what happened. They needed to know why. And they needed to know whether the official explanation was true. At first, they did not have all the answers. They did not have the full picture. They did not know how powerful the evidence would become. Then the video emerged. Faden Santana had recorded it. And when he watched what he had captured, he understood that the footage was important. But possessing such a video was not simple. He was not an investigator. He was an ordinary person suddenly holding evidence connected to a man's death. There was a decision to make. Who should see it? What should he do with it? Could he trust the authorities? Could the recording protect him? Could it help Walter's family? Eventually, Santana provided the footage to members of Scott's family. From there, the video reached investigators. And when investigators saw it, the case changed direction. The footage offered something that eyewitness testimony alone could never provide. It showed movement. It showed distance. It showed the position of the officer. It showed the direction in which Scott was traveling. And it showed the moment the gun was fired. For the first time, investigators could compare the spoken story with the visual record. The comparison would become devastating. Because Walter Scott's final moments were no longer hidden inside a report. They were there on a screen. A man running. An officer behind him. A weapon raised. 8 shots. A body falling. 5 bullets entering from behind. The entire sequence could be watched again and again. Slowly. Frame by frame. The video did not speak. It did not accuse anyone. It simply showed what the camera had captured. And sometimes, that is more powerful than words. The investigation was now entering a different phase. The question was no longer simply what happened to Walter Scott. The question became whether the official account of his death could survive the evidence. Because if the video was telling the truth, then the story of the shooting was about to become very different from the story first told. And somewhere beyond that quiet stretch of North Charleston, Walter Scott's family was waiting. Waiting for answers. Waiting for someone to explain how a traffic stop over a broken brake light had ended with a 50-year-old father lying dead on the ground. They did not yet know that within days, the officer who fired those shots would be arrested. They did not yet know that the case would reach a federal courtroom. They did not yet know that a mistrial would leave the future uncertain. They did not yet know that years later, Michael Slager would stand before a federal judge and admit the essential truth that the video had already shown. All they knew was that Walter was gone. And somewhere in the hands of a stranger was a recording of how he died. That recording would become the bridge between Walter's last moments and the truth that his family had been searching for. But before the courtroom, before the confession, before the sentence, investigators had to reconstruct exactly what happened in those final seconds. And that meant returning to the scene. Returning to the road. Returning to the path Walter Scott had taken when he ran. Returning to the place where the taser fell. Returning to the place where the bullet struck. And returning, again and again, to the footage that had changed everything. Because the next chapter of the story would not be about what people believed. It would be about what the evidence could prove. Before Walter Scott became a name repeated across television screens, before his photograph appeared beside headlines about police violence, before his final moments were watched by millions of strangers, he was simply a man trying to live his life. That distinction matters. Because when a person dies in a violent and controversial way, the public often remembers the ending before it remembers the beginning. A photograph becomes a symbol. A name becomes part of a debate. A few seconds of video become more familiar than decades of life. Walter Scott deserved to be more than the final seconds of a recording. He was 50 years old when he died. He was a father. He was a brother. He was a member of a family that had known him long before the country learned his name. To those closest to him, Walter was not an abstract figure in a national argument. He was someone whose absence would be felt in ordinary places. An empty chair. An unanswered phone call. A doorway where someone expected him to appear. A family gathering where one familiar face would never return. Those are the details that disappear when a human life becomes a headline. Walter had spent years building a life in South Carolina. Like millions of other people, his existence was made up of ordinary responsibilities rather than extraordinary events. He had relationships to maintain, people who depended on him, decisions to make, bills to pay, places to go, and a future he still expected to see. Nothing about the morning of April 4, 2015 suggested that this future was about to disappear. He got into his car. He drove. He moved through a familiar landscape. Perhaps he was thinking about the day ahead. Perhaps his mind was occupied by something completely unrelated to what was about to happen. That is one of the strange things about tragedy. The person approaching the disaster often has no idea that the ordinary moment they are living through will soon become their final one. Walter Scott could not know that the next few minutes would be studied by investigators. He could not know that lawyers would later analyze his movements. He could not know that people who had never met him would argue about his decisions. He could not know that his final actions would become evidence. At some point, the police cruiser appeared behind him. The reason for the stop was a broken center brake light. It was such a small detail. A piece of equipment on a car. A light that was supposed to come on when the brake pedal was pressed. Yet that tiny mechanical failure became the first link in a chain of events that ended with Walter's death. There is something deeply unsettling about that sequence. A life can be moving in one direction, and then suddenly a tiny interruption changes everything. Walter stopped his car. Michael Slager approached. Whatever happened inside Walter's mind during those moments has been debated ever since. What made him leave the vehicle? What made him run? Was he afraid? Was he worried about the consequences of the encounter? Was he simply making a decision in the heat of the moment that he would later never have the opportunity to explain? Those questions remain part of the story, but they should not erase the person behind them. Walter was not defined by the decision to run. He was defined by the life he had lived before that decision. And that life was connected to people. His family would later have to endure the impossible task of separating the Walter they knew from the Walter the public saw on the video. To the world, he became a man running across an open area. To his family, he remained Walter. That difference is enormous. When people watch the footage, they see movement. They see distance. They see an officer chasing a man. They see a gun. They see Walter fall. But his family could look at a photograph and see an entire history. They could remember his face before it became frozen in news reports. They could remember his voice. They could remember conversations that no camera had recorded. They could remember ordinary moments that would never make it into a courtroom. That is the invisible part of every true crime story. The victim has a life that existed outside the crime. There are memories that cannot be entered into evidence. There are jokes that will never be repeated. There are family stories that have nothing to do with the circumstances of death. There are private moments that belong only to the people who loved that person. And when death comes suddenly, those memories become painfully important. Walter Scott was 50 years old. He was not at the end of his life. He was in the middle of it. There were still mornings ahead. Still conversations. Still birthdays. Still family gatherings. Still ordinary problems that would have seemed important at the time. Still opportunities to change his mind, make mistakes, apologize, laugh, complain, forgive, and begin again. All of that disappeared in seconds. That is what makes the shooting so difficult to understand when viewed through the narrow lens of the video. The footage lasts only a short time. Walter's life did not. The camera captured his death, not his existence. And yet that footage would become the central piece of his public identity. It would be watched more often than anyone could have imagined. People would pause it. Replay it. Study the positions of the two men. Count the shots. Examine the direction of Walter's body. Look for the taser. Look at what happened immediately afterward. Every movement would become part of an argument. But there was one thing the video could never show. It could never show who Walter Scott was when nobody was watching. It could never show the person his family knew. That was something only those closest to him could preserve. His family would eventually speak about him as a human being rather than as evidence. That mattered because the public conversation surrounding his death was becoming increasingly intense. By 2015, the United States was already struggling with a series of highly publicized confrontations between police officers and Black Americans. Questions about excessive force, racial inequality, police accountability, and the use of deadly weapons had become part of national conversation. Walter Scott's death entered that landscape. But for his family, the national debate could never replace personal grief. They were not mourning a symbol. They were mourning Walter. There is a particular cruelty in losing someone and then seeing strangers argue about the circumstances of that person's death. Every detail can become public. Every decision can be questioned. Every photograph can be examined. The family is forced to hear strangers discuss someone they loved as though he were a case file. But grief does not operate like a courtroom. There is no evidence standard for missing someone. There is no legal argument that can make an empty space feel occupied again. There is no verdict that brings a person home. That reality followed Walter's family as the investigation developed. The first official explanation of the shooting raised questions. The police account described a struggle and a threat involving the taser. But the family had another piece of information. A video existed. And that video appeared to tell a different story. For the people who loved Walter, this created another emotional burden. They were grieving, but they were also searching. Searching for the truth. Searching for something that could explain why a routine traffic stop had ended with Walter dead. Searching for evidence that would prevent his final moments from being rewritten. The video became that evidence. It did not bring Walter back. It could not erase the pain. But it gave his family something powerful. It gave them a record. A record of the moment when Walter was running away. A record of the officer behind him. A record of the gunshots. A record that could be compared with the words spoken afterward. And perhaps most importantly, it meant Walter's final moments did not depend entirely on the memory of the person who fired the weapon. There was another witness. A silent witness. A camera. The more investigators examined the footage, the more important it became. The position of Scott's body. The direction in which he was running. The location of the taser. The moment Slager raised his gun. The sequence of shots. The actions that followed. Each detail added another piece to the reconstruction. And as those pieces came together, the central question became unavoidable. What exactly happened between the moment Walter Scott ran from the traffic stop and the moment he fell to the ground? The answer would determine everything. It would determine whether Slager's actions could be justified. It would determine whether the officer's account could survive scrutiny. It would determine whether prosecutors would pursue charges. And eventually, it would determine whether a courtroom would accept the argument that Walter Scott had posed a deadly threat. But before the law could answer those questions, there was another truth that needed to remain visible. Walter Scott was a person. He had lived 50 years before that road became the place where his life ended. He had been known by people who loved him. He had occupied a place in a family. He had a history that could not be reduced to the words, traffic stop. And when he died, the people who loved him did not lose a symbol. They lost Walter. That is why his photograph matters. Not because it became famous. Not because it appeared beside a controversial case. But because behind the photograph was a man who had expected to keep living. On April 4th, he left home believing there would be another tomorrow. There would be no tomorrow for Walter. The morning would continue without him. Cars would continue moving through North Charleston. People would continue their errands. The world would not stop. But for his family, time would divide itself into two parts. Before Walter died. And after. The distance between those two worlds was only a few hundred yards. A police stop. A chase. A taser. A gun. 8 shots. 5 bullets. And then silence. But the story was not finished. Because the death of Walter Scott had produced something that could not easily be controlled. Evidence. And that evidence was about to force investigators to look more closely at the man who had pulled the trigger. Michael Slager had given his account. But the camera had recorded another. The next stage of the story would be a battle between those two versions. One would depend on memory, interpretation, and authority. The other would remain frozen in time. And as investigators began placing those two stories side by side, the question would become more disturbing with every detail. What if the official story was not simply incomplete? What if it was wrong? And what if the final seconds of Walter Scott's life had already been recorded by someone who happened to be standing nearby? The answer was waiting inside a small phone. And once investigators saw what that phone had captured, there would be no going back. The moment Walter Scott ran, the encounter stopped being a traffic stop. The flashing lights of the police cruiser remained behind, but the ordinary rhythm of a roadside interaction had disappeared. There was no longer a driver sitting inside a vehicle. There was no longer an officer simply asking questions about a brake light. There were two men moving across open ground. One was running. The other was chasing. And somewhere in the distance, a camera was already watching. Michael Slager followed Walter Scott for roughly 200 yards. The chase unfolded quickly, but the details inside those seconds would later be examined with extraordinary precision. Slager had his taser. Scott continued running. The officer used the electronic weapon once. It did not stop Scott. He tried again. This time, Scott went down. For an instant, his body hit the ground and the chase appeared to be ending. But Scott got back up. He did not turn toward Slager and move aggressively toward him. He continued away. That movement would become the heart of the case. Faden Santana was nearby, holding his phone. At first, he was simply watching. Then he began recording. The camera did not provide a perfect view of everything that had happened before. It did not begin at the traffic stop. It did not capture every interaction between Scott and Slager. It could not explain what each man had been thinking. But it captured the most important final sequence. Scott was running. Slager was behind him. The officer was carrying a firearm. The distance between them remained visible. Then Slager stopped. His body changed position. His arm moved. The gun appeared. And the first shot was fired. There was no time for anyone watching the footage to prepare. The moment comes suddenly. 1 second, Scott is running. The next, the gun is pointed in his direction. Then another shot. And another. 8 shots in total. The sound itself is not the most disturbing part. It is the repetition. The fact that the weapon continues firing while Scott is moving away. The camera captures the terrible simplicity of the scene. Walter Scott is not moving toward the officer. He is moving away. His back is turned. The shots continue. 5 bullets strike him. His body begins to lose its momentum. Then he falls. A man who was alive moments earlier is suddenly motionless on the ground. The chase is over. The camera remains fixed. And that is where the story becomes difficult to look away from. Because the shooting does not end with the final shot. What happens afterward matters too. Slager moves toward the area where Scott has fallen. The taser is nearby. The officer eventually retrieves it. That action would later become one of the most closely examined details in the investigation. Why was the taser there? Where had it fallen? What had happened to it during the encounter? What did Slager believe had happened? And why did the officer's description of the confrontation differ so sharply from what the video appeared to show? Those questions would not be answered immediately. But they were already waiting. At the scene, Walter Scott was dead. There was no opportunity for him to explain his actions. There was no opportunity for him to describe what he feared. There was no opportunity for him to challenge the official account. His body could provide forensic evidence, but it could not provide a narrative. The person who remained capable of speaking was Michael Slager. And Slager had a story. He described the shooting as the culmination of a struggle. He said Scott had taken possession of the taser. He said Scott had used or attempted to use it against him. From the officer's perspective, the shooting was presented as a response to danger. That explanation mattered enormously. Police officers are permitted to use force under certain circumstances. Deadly force is governed by strict legal standards, and the central question in such cases often becomes whether the officer reasonably believed that deadly force was necessary to prevent an imminent threat. The difference between those words and what actually happened can be enormous. An officer facing an immediate attack is one situation. An officer shooting at a person who is running away is another. The investigation therefore had to determine which situation existed when Slager fired. The video appeared to answer that question. But there was still much more to examine. The first task was reconstructing the scene. Investigators had to understand where Scott had been standing, where Slager had been standing, where the taser had fallen, where the shell casings were located, where Scott's body came to rest, how far the two men were from one another, what direction Scott was moving, what direction the officer was facing. The scene became a physical map of the final seconds. Every object could tell part of the story. The spent ammunition could establish the number of shots fired. The body could provide information about the direction of the bullets. The taser could reveal where it had been during the confrontation. And the video could connect those physical facts to human movement. This is what makes a recorded crime different from one witnessed only through testimony. Memory can change. People can misunderstand. People can remember events differently. But a recording can be returned to again and again. Investigators could watch the footage at normal speed. Then they could slow it down. They could pause. They could zoom in. They could compare what the camera showed with what Slager said. The more they examined it, the more difficult it became to reconcile the two accounts. The video did not appear to show Scott turning around and attacking Slager with the taser. Instead, it showed Scott moving away. That did not automatically answer every legal question. But it created a serious contradiction. If Scott had possessed the taser, where was it? If he had been attacking Slager, why did the video show him moving away? If Slager believed he was facing an immediate deadly threat, what exactly was that threat at the moment he fired? These were not minor discrepancies. They went directly to the justification for the shooting. And there was another question. What happened immediately after the gunfire? According to the evidence later developed by investigators, Slager moved back toward the area where the taser had fallen and picked it up. That detail became important because of the possibility that the scene had been altered after the shooting. The significance of that action would become even clearer once investigators compared it with the officer's statements. A crime scene tells a story through objects. But if objects are moved, the story can change. That is why investigators pay attention not only to where evidence is found, but also to whether someone may have moved it. In Walter Scott's case, the taser became more than a piece of police equipment. It became a symbol of the conflict between the official account and the visual evidence. According to Slager's version, the taser was part of the threat. According to the footage, it appeared to be lying on the ground as Scott continued to run. That distinction would become central. The scene itself was changing too. Police officers arrived. Investigators began securing the area. Walter Scott's body remained where he had fallen. The reality of death settled over what had only moments earlier been an active pursuit. There would have been questions about the vehicle. Questions about the traffic stop. Questions about Scott's decision to flee. Questions about the chase. Questions about the taser. Questions about the firearm. Questions about every bullet. And above all, questions about the final seconds. But the investigation would soon encounter something even more powerful than physical evidence. The video. At first, the footage was known only to a small number of people. Santana had recorded it. He had recognized its significance. He eventually gave it to Scott's family. From there, the recording reached authorities. When investigators watched it, the nature of the case changed. The death of Walter Scott was no longer simply a disputed account of an officer-involved shooting. There was now an independent recording of the final moments. And that recording made one thing impossible to ignore. Walter Scott had been running away when he was shot. The distinction between running towards someone and running away from someone is visually obvious. It is also legally significant. A person moving away is not necessarily harmless. A person fleeing can still possess a weapon. A person can still pose a threat from a distance. But in this case, investigators had to determine whether such a threat actually existed. The video became the starting point for that analysis. And once the video became known, public attention intensified. People watched the footage and reacted immediately. For some, the images appeared to speak for themselves. For others, the complete context still needed to be established. The legal process would eventually force the evidence through a much slower process than public reaction. There would be interviews, forensic analysis, court filings, witness testimony, arguments over evidence, arguments over intent, arguments over what Slager knew and believed at the precise moment he pulled the trigger. But before any of that, investigators had to confront a basic problem. The officer's first account did not appear to match what the camera had recorded. That discrepancy became the doorway into a much larger investigation. It was no longer enough to ask why Walter Scott had run. Investigators now had to ask what Michael Slager had done after Scott ran. And perhaps even more importantly, they had to ask what Slager said had happened. Because the case would not be determined solely by the bullets. It would also be determined by words. Words spoken at the scene. Words spoken to investigators. Words used to describe the struggle. Words used to explain the taser. Words that would eventually be compared against the video. The difference between those words and the footage would become increasingly difficult to ignore. For Walter Scott's family, the video offered something they desperately needed. A record of what happened. But it also gave them something painful. They could now see the final moments of Walter's life. They could see him running. They could see the officer following. They could see the shots. They could see him fall. The same footage that offered answers also forced them to confront an image they could never erase. That is the cruelty of evidence in a case like this. Truth can bring clarity. But clarity does not necessarily bring comfort. Knowing exactly what happened does not make what happened less terrible. Sometimes it makes the pain sharper. Walter Scott was still dead. His family still had to live without him. But now they had reason to believe that the story of his death had not been fully told. And that meant the next battle would take place not on the road where Walter fell, but inside interrogation rooms, police offices, prosecutors' files, and eventually courtrooms. The question was becoming increasingly direct. Why had Michael Slager fired 8 shots at a man who was running away? And if his explanation was that Walter Scott had threatened him with the taser, could the evidence actually support that claim? The investigation was about to move deeper into Michael Slager's account. Every word mattered now. Every inconsistency mattered. Every pause mattered. Because investigators had something rare. They had a witness who could speak. They had physical evidence that could be examined. And they had a camera that had captured the final seconds. The official story had been told. Now it had to survive the evidence. And the first serious crack in that story had already appeared. It was sitting inside a phone. A few seconds of footage. A man running away. 8 shots. 5 wounds from behind. And a truth that could no longer be easily hidden. By the time investigators began examining the scene in detail, the road where Walter Scott had died no longer looked like the beginning of a routine traffic stop. It had become a crime scene. The ordinary world was still moving around it. Cars continued along nearby roads. People continued with their Saturday routines. But inside the area investigators had secured, every object suddenly carried significance. A police vehicle. A dead man. A firearm. Spent cartridges. A taser. A trail of movement across the ground. And somewhere inside all of it, investigators were looking for an answer to one question. What happened in the seconds before Walter Scott was shot? The first thing that had to be established was the sequence. Scott had been stopped because of a defective center brake light. He had left the vehicle and run. Officer Michael Slager pursued him. The taser was deployed. Scott fell. He got back up. He continued moving away. Then Slager fired 8 shots. 5 struck Scott. He died at the scene. On its own, that sequence was already disturbing. But investigators knew that a criminal case could not be built entirely on emotion. They needed evidence. They needed to know where the evidence was located. They needed to know whether the physical scene matched the video. They needed to determine whether the officer's explanation was consistent with what could actually be proven. And one object immediately became central. The taser. It was not merely a piece of equipment. It was the object that stood between 2 completely different versions of the shooting. Slager's account suggested that Scott had taken possession of the taser and used it in a way that created a threat. But the video appeared to show something else. The taser was not in Scott's hand as he ran. It was on the ground. That raised an uncomfortable possibility. If Scott had already lost possession of the taser, and if he was running away from Slager, then what danger remained at the exact moment the officer fired? The question became even more important because deadly force is not justified simply because a person has disobeyed an officer or attempted to flee. The circumstances at the moment the weapon is used matter. The officer's perception matters. The actual threat matters. And the distance between the 2 men matters. Investigators therefore examined the physical evidence alongside the recording. The spent shell casings provided a count. 8 shots. The wounds provided another piece of information. 5 bullets entered Walter Scott from behind. That fact was devastating because it corresponded with what the camera appeared to show. Scott was moving away. His body was turned away. The bullets followed him. The physical evidence and the video were telling the same story. But investigators still had to understand what happened immediately before the shooting. The video did not show the entire encounter. It began after the traffic stop had already developed into a chase. That meant there were unanswered questions. What happened during the initial contact? What was said between Scott and Slager? Why did Scott run? What happened when the taser was deployed? Was there a physical struggle? If there was, how long did it last? And exactly where did the taser fall? Those questions mattered because the defense would later depend heavily on the circumstances leading to the shooting. Yet there was another problem. The officer's own words. Michael Slager had an opportunity to explain what happened. He could describe the chase from his perspective. He could describe the struggle. He could explain what he believed Scott was doing. He could explain why he believed deadly force was necessary. But every statement he made would now be compared with the evidence. That changed the nature of an interview. Investigators were not simply listening. They were testing. A statement might sound convincing until compared with a physical fact. A detail might appear insignificant until the video contradicted it. A memory might seem plausible until the location of an object proved otherwise. The investigation became a process of comparison. Words against images. Memory against physical evidence. Official explanation against an independent recording. And in the middle of that comparison was Walter Scott's body. Forensic evidence could not tell investigators everything about his life or his state of mind. But it could tell them about the violence that ended it. 5 bullets had entered from behind. That detail made the direction of the encounter difficult to ignore. Scott was not facing the officer at the moment the bullets struck him. The image recorded by Santana was consistent with that conclusion. The physical evidence was consistent with it. And the question of justification became increasingly difficult to separate from the direction in which Scott was moving. There was another important detail. After the shooting, Slager returned toward the area where the taser had fallen. He picked it up. For investigators, this action mattered because the location of evidence at a crime scene can be critical. A weapon found on the ground can establish what happened during a struggle. But moving that object after a shooting can complicate the reconstruction. Investigators needed to know where the taser had originally been. They needed to understand its relationship to Scott. They needed to determine whether the scene, as it appeared when investigators arrived, accurately represented what had happened in the moments before the shooting. The video provided an answer that photographs alone could not. It showed the sequence. The taser was on the ground. Scott moved away. Slager followed. Then came the gunfire. The camera became almost like a second set of eyes for investigators. It could not feel fear. It could not be intimidated. It could not forget. It could not change its memory months later. It simply preserved the movement. And that made the footage extraordinarily powerful. There was something else about the video that mattered. It had not been created by police. It had not been recorded for the purpose of proving guilt or innocence. It was made by a stranger who happened to see something happening in front of him. That independence gave the footage particular importance. Faden Santana had no obvious reason to invent what the camera recorded. He had simply captured it. When he eventually gave the recording to Walter Scott's family, he did something that would alter the course of the investigation. The family now possessed evidence. They were no longer forced to rely entirely on an official explanation. They could see the final moments themselves. They could compare what they were being told with what the phone had captured. And once investigators received the video, the same comparison became possible on an official level. The footage raised questions that demanded answers. If Scott had been attacking Slager, where was the attack? If Scott had been using the taser against the officer, where was the weapon? If Scott was moving toward the officer, why did the recording show him moving away? If the officer believed he was in immediate danger, what exactly did he see? Those questions would become central to the prosecution. But investigators still had to proceed carefully. A video can be powerful without being complete. It does not show what happened outside its frame. It does not reveal thoughts. It does not automatically establish intent. That is why the investigation expanded beyond the footage. Investigators examined the physical evidence. They examined the statements. They examined the officer's actions after the shooting. They examined the timeline. They examined the taser. They examined the gun. They examined the wounds. And they examined the recording again. The pieces were beginning to fit together. The case was no longer simply a question of whether Walter Scott had run from a police officer. Everyone knew that he had. The more important question was what happened after he ran. The answer was becoming clearer. He had been pursued. He had been struck by the taser. He had fallen. He had stood up. He had continued running. Then he had been shot. That sequence was difficult to reconcile with the claim that the shooting was necessary to stop an imminent attack. And yet the investigation had not reached its final stage. The most important challenge remained. Michael Slager's statements had to be examined in detail. Investigators needed to know exactly what he had told them. Not just the general explanation, but the specific words. Where did he say Scott was standing? Where did he say the taser was? What did he claim Scott had done? What did he say immediately after the shooting? And did those statements remain consistent when confronted with the video? Because if the evidence showed that Slager's story had changed, that would become more than an unfortunate memory problem. It could become evidence of consciousness of guilt. The investigation was approaching that point. The traffic stop had produced a chase. The chase had produced a shooting. The shooting had produced a body. The body had produced forensic evidence. And the evidence had produced contradictions. Now investigators had to follow those contradictions wherever they led. For Walter Scott's family, every new discovery brought a mixture of relief and pain. Relief because the truth seemed to be emerging. Pain because every piece of evidence made the final moments more real. The video had shown Walter running. The wounds confirmed that he had been shot from behind. The taser raised questions about the officer's explanation. And the officer's actions after the shooting raised still more. One by one, the protective layers around the original account were beginning to disappear. What remained was a disturbing sequence that could be reconstructed from evidence rather than assumption. A man stopped for a traffic violation. A man who ran. An officer who chased him. A taser that failed to end the pursuit. A second taser attempt. A man who fell and got back up. A man who continued away. A firearm drawn. 8 shots. 5 bullets entering from behind. A body falling. And a camera recording it all. The scene had spoken. Now the investigators had to determine whether the officer's story could survive what the scene had revealed. Because the next stage would not be about what the public believed. It would be about what Michael Slager had said. And when investigators began comparing his statements against the evidence, the contradictions would become impossible to ignore. The investigation was no longer centered only on what had happened to Walter Scott. It was beginning to focus on what Michael Slager had said happened. That distinction changed everything. A police shooting can be difficult to reconstruct when the only surviving evidence is memory. Witnesses may remember different details. Stress can distort perception. A person may remember an event differently weeks or months later than they did immediately afterward. But the Walter Scott case contained something unusually powerful. A recording existed. Investigators could place Slager's words beside the video and ask a simple question. Did they match? At first, the explanation offered by Slager appeared to revolve around the taser. He said that Scott had taken possession of it during the confrontation. That detail was crucial. The taser was the bridge between a fleeing suspect and an officer claiming that he was under threat. If Scott had actually obtained the weapon and turned it against Slager, the officer could argue that the situation had become dangerous. But if Scott had not possessed the taser when the shots were fired, then the explanation began to collapse. Investigators had to go back to the beginning. They had to reconstruct the chase. The first taser deployment. The second. Scott falling. Scott standing. Scott running. Slager following. Then the gunfire. The more carefully the sequence was examined, the more important the timing became. A person's actions at one moment cannot automatically justify force used several seconds later. An officer might legitimately use force during an attack. But if the threat ends, the justification can end with it. That was the central issue. What was happening at the precise moment Michael Slager fired? The video appeared to provide an answer. Walter Scott was running away. He was not charging. He was not standing over the officer. He was not visibly attacking him. He was moving in the opposite direction. And yet Slager fired 8 times. The physical evidence supported the visual evidence. 5 bullets entered Scott from behind. That meant investigators could not simply dismiss the video as an ambiguous recording. The wounds provided independent confirmation of the direction in which Scott's body had been positioned. The evidence was beginning to form a closed circle. The video showed Scott moving away. The bullet struck him from behind. The taser was found on the ground. Slager later retrieved it. And the officer's account described a threat that the video did not appear to show. The question was no longer whether there was a contradiction. The question was how serious the contradiction was. Investigators from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division examined the case. They interviewed Slager. They questioned him about the shooting. They wanted to know what happened during the chase. They wanted to understand the struggle. They wanted to know how the taser became involved. And they wanted to know why he fired his gun. An interview room can be very different from the side of a road. At the scene of a shooting, events happen quickly. There is adrenaline. There is confusion. There are people arriving. There are emergency procedures. There are competing voices. But in an interview room, the event can be slowed down. A question can be repeated. A statement can be compared with an earlier statement. An investigator can ask about one specific movement and then return to it later. The details begin to matter. Where was Scott? Where was Slager? Where was the taser? What did Scott do? What did Slager do? What happened immediately before the first shot? What happened immediately after the last one? The officer's answers were now being placed against evidence that could not be argued with. The video existed. The physical scene existed. The wounds existed. The shell casings existed. The taser existed. And Walter Scott's body could no longer be moved back into the position of an imagined confrontation. He had been shot from behind. The investigation also had to consider what happened after the shooting. Slager had moved toward the taser. He retrieved it. That action became important because the placement of the taser had been central to his account. If the taser was supposed to demonstrate that Scott had been armed with it during the confrontation, its actual location and movement became crucial. Investigators could not ignore the possibility that the scene had been altered after the shooting. That did not by itself establish criminal intent. But it created another question. Why? Why had the taser been moved? What did Slager believe the scene looked like? What did he want investigators to believe? These questions were becoming more serious. The investigation was moving beyond the question of whether the shooting had been justified. It was beginning to examine whether the aftermath had been manipulated. That distinction would later become important in the legal case. Meanwhile, Faden Santana remained a critical witness. His phone had captured the final moments. He had seen the chase. He had recorded the shooting. And he had given the footage to Scott's family. His role was extraordinary precisely because it was accidental. He had not gone looking for evidence. He had simply seen something unfold and decided to record it. The recording meant that the prosecution did not have to rely entirely on Santana's memory. His testimony could be compared with his video. That made his account particularly important. If he said Scott was running away, the video could be watched. If he described the officer's position, the video could be examined. If he described the taser's location, the footage could be checked. His credibility could be tested against something tangible. That would later matter enormously in court. But at this stage, the investigation was still developing. The country had not yet seen the full legal consequences. The public knew that a black man had been shot by a police officer. The video was beginning to circulate. People were asking questions. How could a man who appeared to be running away have been shot in the back? Why had the officer said Scott posed a threat? What happened to the taser? Why had the officer picked it up afterward? And why did the official explanation appear so different from the footage? Those questions quickly moved beyond North Charleston. The case became part of a much larger national conversation. Across the country, debates about police use of force were already intense. There was increasing public demand for accountability when officers used deadly force. Body cameras and civilian cell phone recordings were changing the way these encounters could be understood. The public was discovering that a few seconds of footage could challenge an official narrative almost instantly. Walter Scott's case became one of the clearest examples. The video did not merely show the shooting. It created a permanent reference point. Whenever someone made a claim about what happened, the recording could be revisited. The case therefore became a battle between narrative and evidence. Slager could describe what he believed. Investigators could examine what the camera showed. The court would eventually have to decide what the evidence meant. And the public could watch the same footage and form its own conclusions. But criminal justice operates differently from public opinion. A prosecutor cannot simply walk into court and say that a video looks disturbing. The government must prove specific legal elements. It must establish what the defendant did. It must establish the circumstances. It must establish the defendant's state of mind where required. It must overcome legal defenses. And it must persuade a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. That meant investigators had to build a case carefully. They needed the forensic evidence. They needed the video. They needed Santana. They needed the statements made by Slager. They needed to establish the timeline. And they needed to understand whether the shooting violated Walter Scott's constitutional rights. 3 days after the shooting, on April 7, 2015, the investigation reached its first major legal turning point. Michael Slager was arrested and charged with murder at the state level. The speed of that arrest was significant. In many police shooting cases, legal proceedings can take months or years before an officer is charged. Here, the video had changed the circumstances dramatically. Investigators were not confronting a case based solely on conflicting eyewitness accounts. They had visual evidence. And that evidence appeared to undermine the officer's explanation. For Walter Scott's family, the arrest represented something they had desperately needed. Recognition that his death required a criminal investigation. But an arrest is not a conviction. It does not prove guilt by itself. The legal process had only begun. Slager would eventually face a state murder trial. Before that happened, however, the prosecution would have to deal with the complicated question of intent. What was going through Slager's mind when he fired? Did he genuinely believe Scott was about to attack him? Did he misunderstand what was happening? Or did he know that Scott was running away and nevertheless decide to shoot? Those questions could not be answered simply by looking at the final frame. They required examination of everything that happened before and after. His training. His statements. His actions. The position of the taser. The video. The wounds. And the sequence of events. The investigation was therefore becoming a psychological reconstruction as well as a physical one. What did Michael Slager perceive? What did he know? What did he believe? And at what point did his perception become incompatible with what was actually happening? The answers would eventually become central to the prosecution's argument. But there was another possibility that investigators could not ignore. What if Slager's account had not merely been mistaken? What if some parts of it had been deliberately constructed to justify the shooting? That question was extremely serious. Because an officer's credibility is not a minor detail in a police shooting case. The badge carries authority. When an officer writes a report, speaks to investigators, or describes a confrontation, those words can shape the entire direction of an investigation. If the account is accurate, it can help investigators understand a chaotic event. If the account is false, it can send the investigation down the wrong path. In Walter Scott's case, the video gave investigators a way to test those words. And the more they tested them, the more contradictions appeared. The story Slager had told about the taser was increasingly difficult to reconcile with the recording. The physical evidence did not support a straightforward image of Scott attacking him. The bullets had entered from behind. Scott was moving away. And the taser was on the ground. The case was becoming something far more serious than a disputed traffic stop. It was now about the use of deadly force, the credibility of a police officer, and the possibility that the truth had been altered after a man was killed. For the Scott family, the emotional stakes were impossible to measure. Every new piece of evidence brought them closer to understanding Walter's final moments. But understanding did not mean healing. There was still an empty space where Walter should have been. There were still questions about why he ran. There were still things nobody could answer. But one question was becoming clearer. Walter Scott had not died in an invisible moment. Someone had seen it. Someone had recorded it. And the evidence was strong enough to force the authorities to act. The arrest on April 7th was only the beginning. The state would eventually put Michael Slager on trial. A jury would hear testimony. The video would be shown. The taser would be discussed. The shooting would be reconstructed. And the defense would have an opportunity to challenge the prosecution's interpretation. The case would enter a courtroom where the difference between 8 gunshots and one man's final decision would be examined in painstaking detail. But before that trial could determine anything, another question had to be answered. Could the state prove murder? That question would eventually lead to one of the most uncertain moments in the entire case. A courtroom. A jury. Conflicting arguments. And a decision that would leave Walter Scott's family without the final answer they had been waiting for. Because even with a video, even with forensic evidence, even with an officer's own changing account, justice would not move in a straight line. The case was about to enter the courtroom. And there, the truth would meet the law. By the time Michael Slager was arrested on April 7, 2015, the image of Walter Scott running away had already begun to change the entire case. The arrest came only 3 days after the shooting. 3 days after a routine traffic stop. 3 days after a chase. 3 days after 8 bullets had ended the life of a 50-year-old man. But an arrest was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the legal battle. The state of South Carolina now had to prove that what happened on that roadside was not a justified use of deadly force, but a criminal act. That meant taking a few seconds of video and turning them into a case that could withstand the pressure of a courtroom. The prosecution had evidence. They had the video recorded by Faden Santana. They had the physical evidence. They had the bullet wounds. They had the taser. They had the statements attributed to Slager. And they had a dead man who could no longer tell the court what he had experienced. But evidence alone does not automatically produce a conviction. A jury had to hear the arguments. The defense would have its own interpretation. And the law required the prosecution to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The central issue was clear. Was Michael Slager justified in using deadly force? Or had he crossed the line into murder? The prosecution would argue that Walter Scott was running away when Slager fired. The defense would attempt to place the shooting within the context of the confrontation that had occurred immediately before it. The difference between those two perspectives would become the center of the trial. The state had to take the jury back to the beginning. A traffic stop. A broken brake light. A driver who got out of his car. A man who ran. A police officer who chased him. A taser. A fall. A second attempt to use the taser. And then the moment when Scott got back up and continued running. The prosecution could not simply tell the jury that the shooting was wrong. It had to show them. That was where the video became so powerful. The footage did not ask the jury to imagine the final moments. It allowed them to see them. Scott's back was toward Slager. The officer followed. Scott continued moving away. The gun came out. 8 shots. 5 wounds. The video could be replayed. Again. And again. And again. Each replay would bring the jury back to the same question. What threat existed at the moment those shots were fired? That question was central to the law. The prosecution argued that there was no immediate threat that justified deadly force. Scott was fleeing. The taser was no longer in his possession. The bullets entered from behind. And the officer's explanation did not fit the footage. The defense faced a difficult problem. It had to explain the evidence without simply pretending it did not exist. That meant focusing attention on everything that happened before the shooting. The struggle. The taser. Scott's decision to run. The officer's perception. The speed of the encounter. The stress of a physical confrontation. These details could be used to argue that Slager's actions had to be understood from his perspective at the time. But the video remained. And the video had no perspective other than the camera. It did not know what Slager felt. It did not know what Scott feared. It simply recorded movement. The prosecution could therefore return repeatedly to what could actually be seen. That made the case unusually concrete. There were no hidden witnesses needed to establish the direction Scott was traveling. The footage showed it. There was no need to depend entirely on memory to establish that the shots were fired while Scott was moving away. The video showed it. And the forensic evidence confirmed that the bullets struck him from behind. Still, the defense had the right to challenge the prosecution's interpretation. The courtroom would therefore become a place where the same few seconds could be described in radically different ways. One side would see a fleeing man. The other would emphasize the confrontation that preceded the shooting. One side would see an unjustified execution of force. The other would focus on the officer's perception of danger. And the jury would have to decide. The case was never only about the gun. It was about what the gun represented. A police officer has authority that an ordinary citizen does not have. That authority exists because society expects officers to protect the public and enforce the law. But that authority also comes with responsibility. When an officer draws a firearm, the consequences can be irreversible. There is no undo button. Once the trigger is pulled, the decision cannot be taken back. That was the reality facing the jury. Walter Scott could not testify. The courtroom could not ask him what he thought was happening. It could not ask him why he ran. It could not ask him whether he was afraid. It could not ask him whether he believed he would survive. His silence was permanent. The only voice left from his side was the evidence. His family's presence. And the recording. The prosecution therefore had to allow the evidence to speak. Faden Santana became a critical witness. He could explain how he came to record the incident. He could describe what he saw. He could establish that the video had not been manufactured for the purpose of the trial. Most importantly, the footage itself could be shown. Santana's role was unusual. He had not been part of the police encounter. He had not known Walter Scott. He had not been involved in the traffic stop. He had simply seen what was happening and pressed record. That ordinary decision had enormous consequences. Without it, the prosecution might have faced a much more difficult case. There might have been conflicting memories. There might have been a police report. There might have been forensic evidence. But there would not have been a direct visual record of the most important moments. The video changed the balance. It also changed the public perception of the case. People across the country watched the footage. Some saw it as unmistakable evidence of wrongdoing. Others argued that the full circumstances still needed to be considered. But inside the courtroom, emotion had to be translated into law. The jury could not simply convict because the footage was disturbing. It had to determine whether the prosecution had proven the specific elements required for murder. And that became the challenge. The prosecution argued that Slager knowingly used deadly force against Scott while Scott was fleeing. The defense attempted to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of the encounter. Then came testimony about the taser. Its location mattered. Its movement mattered. The timing mattered. The prosecution emphasized that Slager had returned to retrieve it after the shooting. That action was important because it suggested that the officer understood the taser's location and its potential importance to the explanation of what had happened. The jury had to consider what that meant. Was it an innocent act? Was it part of standard procedure? Or was it evidence that the scene was being manipulated? The prosecution presented its interpretation. The defense challenged it. The case became a detailed reconstruction of seconds. Not minutes. Seconds. A few seconds in which one man lived and then died. One of the most difficult aspects of the trial was that both sides were dealing with the same physical reality. There was no dispute that Walter Scott had been shot. There was no dispute that Michael Slager fired the weapon. There was no dispute that 8 shots were fired. There was no dispute that 5 bullets struck Scott from behind. The disagreement was about what those facts meant legally. That distinction is fundamental. A person can be killed lawfully under certain circumstances. A police officer can use deadly force when the legal conditions are satisfied. Therefore, the mere fact that Scott had been shot did not automatically establish murder. The prosecution had to prove more. It had to establish that Slager's use of deadly force was unjustified and criminal. That is why the case became a battle over interpretation. The same video could be described as one thing by the prosecution and another by the defense. The same taser could be described differently. The same movement could be interpreted differently. And the jury had to decide which interpretation was supported by the evidence. The trial progressed. Days became weeks. Testimony continued. The family waited. The public watched. The courtroom became another stage where Walter Scott's final moments were replayed. For his relatives, hearing the details could not have been easy. The person they loved was now being discussed in terms of bullets, distances, weapons, movements, and legal standards. His life was reduced to evidence because the law required it. But grief remained outside those legal categories. No matter how precise the testimony became, none of it changed the fact that Walter was gone. Eventually, the case reached the jury. The jurors had to make a decision. They had heard the testimony. They had seen the evidence. They had watched the video. They had considered the arguments. Now they had to determine whether the state had proven murder beyond a reasonable doubt. The wait began. For Walter Scott's family, this was another moment of uncertainty. They had already lost Walter. Now they had to wait to discover whether the legal system would hold Slager responsible for his death. But the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict. The result was a hung jury. There was no final verdict on the murder charge. The trial ended in a mistrial. For the Scott family, the decision was devastating. The video existed. The bullets existed. The physical evidence existed. The contradictions existed. Yet the first trial had not produced the final answer they had hoped for. Michael Slager was not convicted of murder at the state trial. The courtroom door closed without a definitive resolution. But the case did not disappear. It could not. The evidence was still there. The video was still there. Walter Scott was still dead. And the questions remained. What would happen next? Would Slager face another trial? Could federal prosecutors intervene? Could the government bring a different charge based on the violation of Scott's civil rights? The answer would come from another courtroom. This time, the case would move into the federal system. And there, the focus would become even more specific. The federal government would argue that Michael Slager had used his authority as a police officer to deprive Walter Scott of a constitutional right. The case was no longer only about the word murder. It was about the power of the state. A police officer had used the authority of his badge. A man had died. And prosecutors now had to determine whether that authority had been abused. The mistrial had not erased the evidence. If anything, it had made the next stage more important. The case was not over. The story had not reached justice. It had only reached another crossroads. And for Michael Slager, the next courtroom would bring a different legal strategy, a different charge, and a decision that would ultimately determine how many years he would spend behind bars. For Walter Scott's family, it meant one thing. They would have to wait again. Wait for another trial. Wait for another judgment. Wait for another jury. And hope that this time, the law would provide the answer the first courtroom had failed to give them. The video had already told its story. Now the federal justice system would have to decide what that story meant. The first trial had ended without the answer Walter Scott's family had been waiting for. The jury had listened. The evidence had been presented. The video had been shown. The arguments had been made. And still, there was no unanimous verdict on the murder charge. A hung jury. A mistrial. For the family, the result must have felt like another wound opening before the first one had even begun to heal. Walter was still dead. Michael Slager was still alive. And the question of legal responsibility remained unresolved. But the case was not finished. Far from it. While the state prosecution had failed to produce a final verdict, federal prosecutors were examining the same evidence through a different legal lens. The government did not need to rely solely on the question of whether Slager was guilty of murder under South Carolina law. There was another possibility. A police officer can violate a person's constitutional rights by using excessive force. And when that happens under the authority of the state, federal law can provide a separate path to prosecution. That path would become the road that finally led to a definitive judgment. The federal case was built around a simple but powerful allegation. Michael Slager had used the authority of his position as a police officer to deprive Walter Scott of his civil rights. The government argued that the deadly force used against Scott was objectively unreasonable. The phrase sounds clinical. Almost cold. But behind those legal words was a human reality. Walter Scott was running away. He was not facing the officer when the shots were fired. 5 bullets entered his body from behind. He died on the ground. The federal prosecution would force the court to look at those facts again. But this time, the case would unfold under a different legal framework. The government also had something that had become increasingly difficult for Slager to escape. His own words. The evidence showed that the account he had initially given did not match what the video appeared to show. The taser was a crucial part of that conflict. Slager had described it as a weapon Scott had taken during the confrontation. But the footage showed the taser on the ground. Scott was moving away. Slager then fired. Afterward, Slager returned and picked up the taser. Investigators could not simply ignore that sequence. It was part of the evidence. And evidence becomes particularly powerful when it connects several independent facts. The video showed the movement. The forensic evidence showed the bullet direction. The taser established another physical point in the scene. The statements provided the narrative. When all four were placed together, the contradictions became difficult to dismiss as mere confusion. The federal case therefore focused heavily on what Slager had done and what he had known. The question was not simply whether Walter Scott had died. It was whether Slager had intentionally used unreasonable deadly force against him. That distinction mattered. The government needed to establish the elements of the federal offense. The prosecution had to show that Slager acted under color of law, meaning he was using the authority associated with his position as a police officer. That part was not difficult to understand. He had approached Scott during a police traffic stop. He had pursued him while wearing his uniform and acting as an officer. The more difficult question was whether the force he used was objectively unreasonable. The video became central again. The jury would see the same sequence that had already transformed the public understanding of the case. Walter Scott running. Michael Slager following. The gun being raised. The shots. Scott falling. The footage was not a reconstruction. It was not a diagram. It was not a description written by an investigator. It was the event itself, captured as it unfolded. And because the video existed, the jury could watch it and then listen to the arguments about what it meant. That is one of the unusual powers of video evidence. A witness can be challenged. A memory can be questioned. A statement can be disputed. But a recording remains. The only debate is over how to interpret what it shows. The federal prosecution could point to the simplest fact. Scott was moving away. The defense could discuss the moments before the shooting. But the final seconds remained visible. The gun was fired while Scott's back was turned. The physical evidence reinforced that conclusion. The prosecution also emphasized the officer's conduct after the shooting. Slager had moved toward the taser. He picked it up. That action was presented as part of a broader pattern of attempting to support a false explanation for the shooting. If Scott had been holding the taser when Slager fired, the officer's account might have been supported by physical evidence. But the video showed the taser on the ground. That contradiction became increasingly important. The case had moved beyond a question of perception. It was now a question of credibility. Could the jury believe Slager's version of events when the video contradicted key elements of it? Could his actions after the shooting be understood as innocent? Or did they show an awareness that the shooting itself had been unjustified? The prosecution argued that Slager had knowingly violated Scott's rights. The defense attempted to challenge that conclusion. But the case was no longer where it had been immediately after the shooting. Years had passed. The video had become widely known. The investigation had been completed. The state trial had ended in a hung jury. And the federal government had brought its own prosecution. The legal pressure was now enormous. For Walter Scott's family, the federal case offered another opportunity. Another jury. Another chance for the evidence to be considered. But there was also uncertainty. Nothing in the legal system guaranteed the outcome. The first jury had failed to reach a unanimous decision. The family knew that evidence could be interpreted differently by different people. They had already experienced what it felt like to walk into a courtroom hoping for justice and walk out without a verdict. This time, they could only wait. The federal proceedings eventually moved toward a critical moment. Michael Slager would have to decide how to respond to the federal charge. And on May 2, 2017, he made a decision that changed the case permanently. He pleaded guilty. The man who had once described Scott as a threat now admitted the essential facts necessary for the federal civil rights conviction. The plea was not simply another procedural step. It was the moment when the case stopped being a battle over whether the video had been interpreted correctly. The defendant himself accepted responsibility for the federal offense. According to the plea agreement, Slager admitted that he had fired 8 shots at Walter Scott. He admitted that Scott was unarmed and running away. He admitted that 5 of the bullets struck Scott from behind. And he admitted that the deadly force had been objectively unreasonable. Those admissions were devastating because they addressed the central facts directly. The video had shown them. The physical evidence had supported them. And now Slager had formally acknowledged them. The courtroom no longer had to rely on competing stories to establish those facts. The plea agreement created a clear legal record. Walter Scott had been fleeing. Michael Slager had fired. Scott had been struck from behind. And the force had not been justified. The emotional meaning of that moment was different for everyone involved. For prosecutors, it was the resolution of a case that had generated national attention. For Slager, it meant accepting responsibility and facing the possibility of a long federal prison sentence. For the Scott family, it was something more complicated. A guilty plea could provide recognition. It could provide an official acknowledgement that what happened to Walter was wrong. But it could not provide the thing they ultimately wanted most. Walter himself. No sentence could bring him back. No courtroom could return the morning to April 4, 2015. No legal document could erase the image of him running. The plea could only establish responsibility. The next question was punishment. How much time would Michael Slager spend in prison? That decision would belong to a federal judge. The sentencing process would require the court to consider the nature of the crime, the circumstances surrounding it, and the factors that influenced the appropriate punishment. The judge would hear arguments from prosecutors. The defense would have an opportunity to speak. The court would consider the evidence. And Walter Scott's death would once again be examined in a room filled with people who had never known him the way his family had. The sentence would eventually become one of the defining moments of the case. But before it arrived, the guilty plea itself represented a major turning point. For more than 2 years, the central conflict had been between 2 versions of the same event. Slager's initial account and the video. Now those 2 versions were no longer equal. The defendant had admitted the essential truth. The story that had begun with a broken brake light had reached a federal courtroom. The chase that had lasted only moments had produced years of legal proceedings. A man who had been alive on a spring morning in South Carolina was now represented by evidence, testimony, and legal documents. And the officer who had pulled the trigger was no longer simply claiming that he had responded to a threat. He had pleaded guilty to violating Walter Scott's civil rights. The case had finally crossed the line from uncertainty to accountability. But justice had one final question to answer. How much should a life lost through an unlawful use of deadly force cost? The answer would come on December 7, 2017. On that day, Michael Slager would stand before a federal judge and learn how many years of his own life would be taken away because of the decision he had made on April 4, 2015. The courtroom would be quiet. The sentence would be read. And the name Walter Scott would once again be spoken. But this time, it would not be the name of a suspect. Not the name attached to a traffic stop. Not merely the name in a police report. It would be the name of the man whose death had forced the justice system to confront the actions of the officer who shot him. The final judgment was approaching. And for Walter's family, it represented the last major chapter in a journey that had begun with a desperate question. What really happened to Walter? The video had answered much of that question. The evidence had answered more. The guilty plea had answered what remained. Now the court would decide the punishment.